But now I am ready to introduce our guest for this evening, Stephen Ujifusa. I'm very excited about this because I'm a big ocean liner buff as well, and I don't think we do enough maritime history. We don't really think about maritime history here at Greenwich Village, so this is very, very west side. And I'm very excited to have Stephen back because when I was at the Seaport Museum, he presented on his previous fantastic book, which I can't highly recommend enough, On the Age of Sail, Barons of the Sea. So get his book here and get his previous book as well. Get all his books because they're all fantastic. But now to introduce Stephen, he is a historian that chronicles the confluence of American business, social, and maritime history. His current book tells the story of Eastern European Jewish immigration to the U.S. in the late 19th and 20th centuries, and it was released back in 2023. Stephen, a warm welcome.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction and for all your hard work making this happen. Also like to thank Anthony Beloff for his hard work, and above all, I am very grateful to my good friend Carl Raymond, who interviewed me on the Gilded Gentleman podcast a few months ago, and it was he that connected me with village preservation. And I would not be here tonight without him. So thank you, Carl. And it's really a wonderful human being. And it's good to be back in New York City. I am a New Yorker originally. I spent the first 7 years of my life on the Upper West Side before moving to Chappaqua. I've lived in Philadelphia for the past 20 years, raising my family there, but I still feel like I'm home when I'm here. And also, as a side note, my mother, after graduating from Sarah Lawrence in 1968, did a pretty long stint at the Village Voice. So she was and lived down here. So this place is very much home. But as William mentioned, we don't think that much about New York City as a port anymore. The port is sort of removed from the public consciousness. So all shipping right now has been sent off to Elizabeth, New Jersey, because of containerization. But up until the 1950s, through most of New York's history, from the Dutch settlement all the way up to the 1950s, this was a working port town. It appears on both sides of the island, on the east and the west side. And this was a port of arrival for hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of immigrants over the years. And today that's sort of we haven't really thought about this arrival by ship, this journey, but the peak years of immigration into the United States were between 1881 and 1914, when they were cut off by World War I. This is a time when there was tremendous demand from Gilded Age industrialists for cheap immigrant labor. And America had relatively open immigration laws, as it had since its founding in 1776, or even before that. This is a place of refuge and opportunity for European immigrants. And one historian told me that this book, and I'm very grateful that he read it, Daniel Jurgen told me that this book, The Last Ships from Hamburg, and I deeply appreciate this, is the sequel to Fiddler on the Roof. Now, we all know that the ending sequence of Fiddler on the Roof, where the residents of this miserable little Russian shtetl called Anatevka in the Russian Hill settlement, maybe around 1895, they're forced out of their village by the authorities. And in Tsarist Russia, Jews were not allowed to own land, and they could be moved out in a minute's notice. They could also be conscripted for the military. Boys as young as 10 or 11 were taken away from their families, and if they came back after 20 years or so, they would come back no longer Jewish, no longer knowing their families. But about this little village, they sing about how much they love this place, they hate this place, someone should have said a matchless place years ago, but where else could Sabbath be so sweet? And then we all see them leaving, and we assume most of them go to America, and then the curtain comes down. We don't know how they get to America. The next image we have is, oh, they're on an ocean liner and they arrive in New York Harbor and they're crying at the Statue of Liberty, and that's it. But what happened in between them? Well, this family shown here is a typical Russian Jewish family, but this picture is not taken in Anatevka or any village like it. It's not taken in New York City. It's taken in the port city of Hamburg, Germany, around 1900. The largest port of departure for immigrants from Eastern Europe, Jew and Gentile. And this family has endured an illegal border crossing. They have endured a 1,000-mile journey by foot and by rail, and in that rail portion, in a sealed train from the Russian-German border to the port of Hamburg, where they were offloaded at a station outside of Berlin, where they were inspected again for diseases and lice. And here they are in Hamburg at this giant complex called the Auswandererhalle, which was the immigration village that was set up by the mighty Hamburg-American Line, today's Hapag-Lloyd. Up to 10,000 immigrants could be housed here while waiting for their ocean liner to take them to America. So this is a family that has sold everything they had owned to pay for the steamship voyage. This was not a cheap journey, probably the equivalent of $1,500 per person by steamship in third class or steerage. Then throw in the rail tickets and then throw in the $25 or so, that's about maybe $1,000 or so you needed on your person when you showed up at Ellis Island. This is like maybe for this family they spent the equivalent of $15,000 to $20,000, which is a lot of money for an impoverished family. They have said goodbye to everyone they knew. They know they could never go back to Russia because going back to Imperial Russia was not an option for these Jewish immigrants. And here they are, nervous, a little traumatized, one a little traumatizing, and waiting to board their ship. They'd never seen the ocean before, and now they're going to board some gigantic ocean liner, 4 city blocks long. 2,000 to 3,000 of them will be shoved into the bottom of a giant luxury liner. They would not see any of the luxury on that liner. They were the profit center for the steamship company. And over the course of this great wave of immigration from Eastern Europe between 1881 and 1914, an estimated 2 to 2.5 million Jews fled Eastern Europe, predominantly from the Russian Empire. The Russian Empire had about 4 million Jews. Almost half of them made the decision to leave. But these immigrants, many of the first generation had a hard go of it. A lot of them didn't make it. A lot of them suffered industrial accidents, died of tuberculosis in miserable tenements in the Lower East Side or in Brownsville, Brooklyn. But as the historian David McCullough said, that first generation gave more than they got, and ultimately would lead to wonderful contributions in this first and second generation. The creation of modern Hollywood with actresses such as Lauren Bacall, born Betty Joan Persky, legal leaders such as Justice Felix Frankfurter and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. American musical theater and popular music, the Great American Songbook, can be heavily credited to Jewish immigrants or second generation Jews, such as Irving Berlin, who, as a young boy at the age of 5, his ship sailed past the Statue of Liberty, which is only about 10 years old, and at the base of that statue was the poem by Emma Lazarus, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free." Several decades after his arrival, Irving Berlin would set those words to music. He would also write the words and music to what could be argued as America's second national anthem, and a song that was sung by all members of Congress of both parties after the terrorist attacks of 2001, "God Bless America." Irving Berlin was someone who deeply, deeply believed in the promise of America. George Gershwin, who grew up not too far from here in the Lower East Side, he basically created modern American musical theater, synthesizing Jewish music, African American music, European classical music, and what he called his own synthetic national opera. Examples of which include Porgy and Bess, and also that quintessential New York symphonic piece, Rhapsody in Blue. And where would we be without Jewish humor? As one, here are the Marx Brothers right here, as one very non-Jewish friend of mine from Philadelphia said, before the Jews came to America, I don't know how funny we were. We had Mark Twain, Abraham Lincoln, they were funny. But it was, he said that Jewish humor is today's modern American humor. So these people gave so much, they often felt they had their hands on the window, like so many immigrants do, then as now. But they took in American culture, reflected it back to America, and gave it their own special twist. My own family's story is fairly typical. My great-grandparents on my mom's side immigrated to this country around 1895. Pictured here on the left are my great-grandparents Isaac and Anna Schlafstein, who My great-grandfather came here with $10 in his pocket, and he opened a butter and egg business. He started probably with a push cart. And by the time my grandmother was born in 1916, she was the youngest of 8 children, he established a very comfortable upper middle class life for himself in Brooklyn. He had a store on the Lower East Side and sold butter and eggs to ocean liners, hotels. He even traveled out to Utah to get the very best butter and eggs. And my grandmother met my grandfather, Jerome Brooks, right here at NYU, where they graduated in 1937. And like so many second generation Americans, they wanted to assimilate, they wanted to be Americans. These pictures, they're clearly taking their cue from Hollywood shots at the time. But my grandmother, I would ask her, she died in 2015, did your parents ever talk about the old country? And she said, no, it was not. It was kind of a forbidden topic. The only thing that she mentioned was that her mother, when she was taken away with a peasant with a horse-drawn wagon to the railroad station, she yelled out at her younger half-sisters, one day I will send for you, one day I will send for you. And about 10 or 15 years later, steamship tickets arrived and her younger half-sisters came. But she said her father was very proud to be an American. He learned English, unlike my great-grandmother, who didn't want to bother with it. But he would hang out a big American flag over the stoop of their townhouse in Crown Heights every 4th of July. But this is something that is typical not just for Jews, but also for a lot of immigrants who come to this country. On one hand, they want to remember, at the same time, they want to assimilate. But also, that is particular for Eastern European Jewish immigrants, there's something they very, very, very much wanted to forget. Unlike Italians, for example, who came here also en masse around the same time, Italian immigrants had a high frequency of going back and forth between the mother country and this country to see family. Sometimes they would make some money in return, but for most Russian Jews, that was not an option because what they were fleeing was so horrendous that they wanted to blot it from their memories. And the ultimate fear was if they did not pass the immigration checks at Ellis Island, if they were deemed to be mentally ill or physically defective, they thought that if they would be sent back to Russia, that would be a death sentence. As one immigrant said, if I was to get turned away from Ellis Island and sent back in North Carolina, I would jump overboard. I would never want to see Russia again. And this is what they were fleeing from. State-sanctioned anti-Semitism. It was not the Germans who invented state-sanctioned anti-Semitism. It was the Russian Empire. It was Tsarist Russia that basically went backwards while all other European countries were becoming more progressive towards Jews. In 1881, Tsar Alexander II, who was moving the country ever so slightly from autocracy to constitutional monarchy, he was blown to pieces by an anarchist bomb in St. Petersburg. His son, Alexander III, saw this and was just appalled and said, see, this is what happens when Mother Russia moves towards Western notions of democracy, constitutional monarchy, representative government. What Russia needs is a return to good old-fashioned orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. And he really cracked down on the cultural life of most of Russia's minorities. These included Muslim Uzbeks, these included Armenians, Georgians, people that did not fit into the Orthodox Christian, culturally Russian mold. But he had particular hatred for Russia's 4 million Jews, who he blamed for the death of his father and called them Christ killers. And his closest advisor, Konstantin Papadopoulos, who was basically the equivalent of his attorney general, he was also the chief attorney for the Russian Orthodox Church, said, the best solution for the Jewish question in Russia would be if 1/3 die, 1/3 immigrate, and 1/3 just disappear. Assimilate, disappear, convert, who knows? This cannot stand. And Alexander III and his successor, his son, the last Tsar, Nicholas II, instituted a multi-pronged attack on Russia's Jews to make life as unpleasant for them as possible, to get them to either assimilate or to leave. One was military conscription, which I mentioned earlier. The Tsar's army would come by and basically take all the boys from a village. as young as 10 or 11 years old and put them into the Tsar's army for up to 10 to 20 years, basically a death sentence. The second was pogroms, in which Russian subjects, ordinary Russian subjects, were encouraged to take out their anger and resentment on the Jewish population. Russia's Jews were confined to the western part of the empire in what is modern-day Ukraine, Belarus. They were not allowed to live in St. Petersburg. They were not allowed to live in Moscow. And Russia was going through a lot of social turmoil at the time. There was a lot of revolutionary ferment. There was rapid and uneven industrialization. There was great income inequality. And the great thing, the Tsar found anti-Semitism to be a really nice tool. Be like, okay, you feel bad, you feel poor, well, take it out on the Jews. They're the ones who are, for centuries have been allowed to loan money to, blame your problems on them. And these riots that would take place in these villages and towns and even cities would not just include regular Russian, peasants. They would also include university students. They were particularly violent on Easter, and the situation got to be absolutely untenable. Also, increasing restrictions on Jewish business life, above and beyond Jews being not able to own land. And this is in marked contrast to countries such as the newly unified German Empire, where Jews were given full citizenship rights. Same with Austria-Hungary, where Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria declared that anti-Semitism is now against Austro-Hungarian state policy, and Jews are welcomed as full subjects. A lot of his other subjects didn't quite agree with that, but this led to a great flowering of Jewish life in Vienna, a great flowering of Jewish life in Imperial Germany. Granted, they still could not be in high positions in government, but still compared to centuries before, this was seen as a huge improvement. These countries did not want to welcome Russian Jews into their borders. The only country that was willing to do that was the United States of America, which had relatively unrestricted immigration, except for the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. And the problem was there was no direct port for these Russian Jews to sail from the Russian Empire to the United States. It was the Germans and the British that were at the forefront of maritime and ocean liner design. By the 1880s, ships were steam powered, built out of steel, could sail pretty much nonstop between Western Europe and the United States. And the German ports had a desire for these immigrants. The problem was how to get them there. So enters the man who was the architect of this mass immigration, arguably the man who was responsible for more than anyone else. He was a German Jew named Albert Ballin, who was born in what was then the Free Hanseatic city of Germany in 1857. His father ran an immigrant ticketing business that basically bought tickets in bulk from steamship companies such as the Hamburg-American Line, which still exists today. It's called Hapag-Lloyd, and then sell them to immigrants who would come to Hamburg looking for passage. Albert Ballin grew up in a lower middle class family that was downwardly mobile. Ultimately, Albert Ballin spent most of his life living in a slum near the Hamburg waterfront. He knew anti-Semitism when he saw it, even though Hamburg had a small and fairly prosperous Jewish population that included most notably the Warburg family and also the family of the composer Felix Mendelssohn. For most poor Jews, the city of Hamburg life was very, very hard. He knew what it meant to have little other boys throw stones at him and scream "dirty Jew" or "hep hep," which was a term that was used when someone wanted to point out a Jew. But when his father died in 1874, he had to drop out of school and take over this immigration business. And by the 1880s, he had turned it around and was extremely successful, partnering with several smaller steamship lines. And then in 1886, he was hired by the biggest steamship line in town, the mighty Hapag or Hamburg-American Line, which hired him as its chief of its passenger division. By 1899, Albert Ballin was appointed general director of the Hamburg-American Line, the equivalent of CEO, which is an astonishing rise for a Jewish kid with humble origins in what was now the unified German Empire. It was unified, the German-speaking lands, most of them were unified in 1871 under the Hohenzollern family of Prussia. And Albert Ballin, like so many German Jews at his time, he knew that there were certain things that barred him from rising to the highest levels of German society. He could not, for example, own stock in his own company because he was a Jew. He was considered for a high diplomatic office because he was such a skilled conversationalist and he was so well connected. But the only way he could become a diplomat or be in the foreign service was to convert to Christianity. He said he could not do that, even though he married a Christian woman in 1885. He said that would dishonor the memory of my dead father. But like so many German Jews, he felt, well, okay, this is not ideal, but still, this is a heck of a lot better than what we knew before unification. And he had a tremendous optimism about Germany. He formed an interesting relationship with Kaiser Wilhelm II, who had many, many Jewish friends and ennobled many Jewish families. But Kaiser Wilhelm II liked anything to do with ships, with naval vessels, with ocean liners. He loved that Albert Ballin was building these gigantic grand ocean liners and was sending them to England and America. So it made Germany look really, really good. And Albert Ballin was designated as being suitable for presentation at court. The Kaiser visited his mansion in Hamburg many, many times. But Albert Ballin also just had this feeling that whenever he visited Berlin, was hanging out with the Kaiser's inner circle. And the German government was disproportionately run by old-fashioned Prussian landowning aristocrats, not the new German industrial class. He said, I just knew that they didn't like me there, especially the Empress. Kaiser and Augusta Victoria despised him, calling him just an interloper, a businessman, and worse. But Albert Ballin struck a deal with Kaiser Wilhelm II because there's this huge border problem where you have all these refugees, most of them were Jewish, that were trying to cross into Germany to get to Hamburg. And there are these migrant camps on this border. People were being smuggled across the border by basically what we call coyotes today, or paid smugglers. And people were drowning, crossing rivers, trying to get to the port of Hamburg. And he struck a deal with the Kaiser in 1893 saying, look, the Hamburg-American Line and my competitor, the North German Lloyd Line, will take over every single border control station along the border, and we will make sure everyone trying to cross into the German Empire who are migrants will be ticketed. We'll make sure they have tickets, and if they don't, we'll make sure Jewish aid organizations can subsidize those tickets. We'll put them on sealed trains, make sure they don't have diseases, and send them right to Hamburg. And they will be out of Germany, and we make money, and the migrants get to go to America. Everyone's happy. Well, it was a very strange deal, but a profitable one, and one that would lead Albert Ballin to be under a lot of attack from the German Jewish community, being called an exploiter of his own people. His closest friend was another wealthy German Jew, Max Warburg. Max Warburg was the head of the investment bank M.M. Warburg & Company. It was the most powerful investment bank in Imperial Germany. He was from a very old Jewish family, and the Warburg Bank financed the growth of Hapag during these key years, allowing it to build, for example, the world's first purpose-built cruise ship in the 1890s. By this time, ships were big enough and luxurious enough that people would go on them for fun. They wouldn't be just things that you have to take from point A to point B. This ship here, the Princess Victoria Louise, named after the Kaiser's only daughter, is the great-great-grandmother of every modern cruise ship. Frankly, I think it's a lot much more attractive than those floating apartment blocks we see today. He also did a very clever, Albert Ballin, Max Warburg, cooked up a very clever cross-brand marketing scheme where they made a deal with the Ritz-Carlton Company, where this company would operate specialty restaurants on Hamburg-American Line ships. So if you paid extra if you're traveling first class, you could eat in a Ritz-Carlton branded restaurant. So it was sort of first class plus. This became quite a thing on Hamburg America ships, and Albert Ballin really took first class travel on the seas to the next highest level, way ahead of the British, who eventually found themselves doing catch-up. The idea of the ship as a floating luxury hotel was Albert Ballin's idea. The two of them were very, very close. The families were extremely close. Albert Ballin became godson to Max Warburg's only son, Eric. And they had a private telephone line that went across the Ferdinandstrasse in Hamburg between their offices. And the letters that survive between them are really wonderful and funny. I mean, Albert Ballin, I think, always had a bit of an anxiety problem. He always felt, because he grew up in such great poverty, I think he always was afraid that someone was about to topple him over or he would lose everything. Max Warburg was kind of his, a bit of his shrink in a way. It's a really nice relationship between these two. But first class was all well and good, but most of the company's profits came from carrying steerage passengers, Jew and Gentile alike. A typical Hamburg-American Line luxury liner of around 1905 would be maybe 750 feet long, carry 800 in first class, 500 in second, and 2,000 to 3,000 at $30 a head. And steerage was a business of numbers. The Auswandererhallen, the immigrant halls, basically industrialized what had previously been a very chaotic process, where they were confined to this basically walled compound on the city outskirts rather than in boarding houses that they'd been before. The city of Hamburg had a guild of swindlers that would take advantage of these immigrants who showed up and they didn't speak the language, they didn't have much money, and they'd basically be fleeced by these swindlers. So this made the whole process much more efficient. But Albert Ballin, as I mentioned earlier, was criticized by many members of the German Jewish bourgeoisie for being an exploiter of his own people. But Albert Ballin said, "Do you have any other ideas? This is the best way I can get them through the country." And he was loathed by the German far right, who was extremely anti-Semitic, especially the Prussian ruling class. The court preacher to the Hohenzollern ruling family wrote of Ballin and other wealthy and noble Jews like him that there is nothing more frightening than these strangers from Palestine who have gotten to the closest reaches of the Kaiser's throne. He was also hated by the German left, by the Social Democrats, who saw him as a capitalist exploiter. And this cartoon up in the center shows Albert Ballin as basically this predator of the seas that is swamping the little guy. So he found himself kind of walking a tightrope as a patriotic German, as a Jew who wasn't really, he would show up at synagogue occasionally. He and his wife Mariana they adopted a daughter at the age of 2 who they raised Lutheran. But as I mentioned earlier, Albert Ballin could not make that step to convert to Christianity himself. He was even floated to be Chancellor of Germany in 1907, but and the Kaiser thought no better person could be Chancellor of Germany, but Ballin got wind of this and said, "Sorry, Your Majesty, you can't do that, you no longer." Conditions on board these ships, well, a study in contrast. On the left is a picture of a steerage compartment on a German ocean liner around 1900. Big open dormitories, no privacy. In the very bottom of these grand luxury liners, as one immigrant said, you could see a lot of water, but you couldn't see the sky out the portholes. In 1905, Albert Ballin pioneered the serving of kosher food on his ocean liners, and also such things as separate cabins for families traveling together. So other steamship lines followed suit with the kosher kitchens. But contrast this with the unbelievable luxury of the first class spaces on ships such as the SS Imperator of 1913. This first class lounge here, one of many grand public spaces, was designed by the same architect that did the Ritz Hotel in Paris. Ballin had very, very good taste. Like a lot of people who were born poor, he loved the good things in life, but it was third class and steerage that paid for these grand luxury liners. Now, coming back to the United States, this was a time before any social welfare or government assistance for poor people, let alone immigrants. And this role for these hundreds of thousands of Jews who showed up in cities such as New York, Philadelphia, Boston, was filled largely by one man who coordinated this charitable relief to welcome these immigrants. He was an immigrant himself, Jakob Heinrich Schiff, who would anglicize his name to Jacob Henry Schiff. He was born in the Jewish ghetto of Frankfurt in the German Confederation in 1847. He was raised in a strict Orthodox family. He was very proud that he came from a rabbinical family. He claimed that he could trace his ancestry back to King David himself. His father was kind of a low-level employee of the ascendant Rothschild family. And as a teenager, Jacob Schiff told his dad that he wanted to leave the Frankfurt ghetto and come to America. His father hated this idea, and eventually, after a lot of fighting, his father said, "Fine, you can go. Here's a few $100s and a package of kosher meat that I hope will last you on the journey by sailing ship. And you must swear, Yaakov, that you must maintain your Jewish faith in America." Jacob Schiff kept his word on that. He arrived in 1865 in New York City. He took a job with a small investment bank called Kuhn, Loeb and Company that was also run by German Jewish immigrants. And he had the very good sense to fall in love with the head partner's daughter, Teresa Loeb. And soon after marrying Teresa, he approached his father-in-law Solomon and said, "Look here, you're kind of a two-bit operation here. We can do a lot better than this. Like we were previously in dry goods in Cincinnati, but I think the future of this country is in something else. It's called railroads." Solomon Loeb thought, "Shut up. This is too risky." Solomon Loeb was a very risk-averse guy. And Jacob Schiff said, just let me go out there and pound the pavement and make a few deals. We can make a lot of money underwriting railroad securities. By the 1890s, Kuhn, Loeb and Company is second only to J.P. Morgan and Company as an investment bank. They are the investment bankers to the Pennsylvania Railroad, the Rockefeller family, and the Union Pacific. This makes Jacob Schiff one of the richest Jews in America. A millionaire many times over. He does not have many rich man's hobbies. He collects a little bit of art. He buys a vacation home on the Jersey Shore. And he really sees America as the promised land for the Jews. He's like, look at this. I come over from Frankfurt, from this, this crummy little house that my family's inhabited for centuries, and now I'm this big cheese. I'm being invited to have dinner with people like Theodore Roosevelt, like the 13th, the 14th, the 15th Amendment. This country eliminated slavery. They give, they allow for birthright citizenship. What a wonderful country this is. I think America should be the promised land for the Jews. He said, my mission in life is to have as many Jews from the Russian Empire come to this country as possible. Like a lot of German Jews, Jacob Henry Schiff had deep affection for Germany. He felt religiously Jewish but culturally German. And a lot of these Jews in his class, and there are a lot of them, a lot of German Jews that have risen into the middle and upper class, they were not invited to socialize with Christian high society, but they did keep to themselves. They only married each other. And they had German nannies at home. They would go to Germany all the time for vacation. Jacob Schiff said the real enemy of the German people is the Tsar. He called Tsar Nicholas II and Alexander III the great Satan of the Jewish people. These were the rulers that were persecuting the Jewish people more than any other. It was also, remember, the Russian imperial throne that had cooked up this forgery that we know today as the Protocols of the Elders of Zion that was planted to basically deflect all sorts of blame from the failings of the Russian government during the Russo-Japanese War and say, oh, there's some big Jewish conspiracy to control the world. I mean, that was the Russian, Imperial Russia thing. So he said, there are all these Jews showing up here. We need to set up this whole network of settlement houses, hospitals, lending institutions to get these Jews on their feet. This is something that other immigrant groups did, the Irish, the Italians did. But Jacob Schiff, because of his enormous wealth, did it on an absolutely massive scale, setting up organizations such as the Henry Street Settlement House, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society that gave microloans to pushcart peddlers like my great-grandpa, the Montefiore Hospital, and a lot of these donations he gave anonymously. So he was someone who, and his daughter, by the way, married a gentleman named Felix Warburg, who was the brother of our Ballin's good friend, Max Warburg. These German Jewish families were very tightly intermarried on both sides of the Atlantic. I mean, business was family for Kuhn, Loeb and Company and for Warburg and But Jacob Henry Schiff was, I wouldn't say he was a exactly funny guy. He was very, very serious, very kind of stereotypically German, very severe. His children were terrified of him. If you were late to Shabbos services at his mansion on Fifth Avenue, his son Mortimer remembered that his father's rage was pretty traumatizing. But he was serious about his role. There was tension, however, between the German Jews and the Russian Jews. The German Jews, who had largely come over in the 1840s and 1850s, a lot of them had become quite wealthy, a lot of them voted Republican, and lived in townhouses in the Upper East, and especially the Upper West Side. The Russian Jews who came over in the 1880s and 1890s, they lived in tenements in the Lower East Side or in Brownsville, Brooklyn. They spoke a variant of German, we all know as Yiddish, that the German Jews found incomprehensible, if not horrifying. And they were also tended to be politically left. Especially a lot of Jews who would, basically decided not to practice formally religiously, became Marxists and socialists, and that created a big divide between these two communities. But Jacob Schiff said, I don't care, and a lot of the other German Jews really were embarrassed by these people. But Jacob Schiff, even though he himself had a snobbery towards them, he made a point, whenever he would show up at one of his aid organizations on the Lower East Side, he said, I would never take a carriage, I walk. You do not make a big show of your wealth, especially when you're dealing with people less fortunate than yourself. And by the way, this is a guy that walks 60 blocks every day from his house on Fifth Avenue to the offices of Kuhn, Loeb and Company in Lower Manhattan. So he practiced what he preached. And ultimately, these two groups, they resented each other, but they also needed each other, because it was German Jewish philanthropy that basically funded a lot of social support that these Russian Jews would not have had. A lot of the Russian Jews, on the other hand, said whenever we met with, our leaders met with these leaders of these German Jewish charities, we were met with in dark wood-paneled rooms and met with stern faces. So this divide maybe sort of continues to stay, although less so. I've been asked often, how did the arch-goy J.P. Morgan get into this act? How did he get into the story? Well, he saw what Albert Ballin was doing, and he said, I want a piece of this action. J.P. Morgan, as an investment banker, had made his $80 million fortune consolidating competing railroads and sugar firms and rubber firms into giant monster trusts that operated as monopolies and ran efficiently and threw off nice profits for stockholders. He looked at the transatlantic run, and he saw all these competing steamship lines and said, what if I just buy these all and just put them under one roof? The mastermind for this idea was a Philadelphia Quaker shipping magnate named Clement Briscoe, who owned the Red Star Line that operated between Antwerp and Philadelphia. And the two of them, starting in 1901, began basically an attempted roll-up of every single transatlantic steamship company. The biggest purchase was the famed British White Star Line in 1902 for $30 million cash. He tried to buy the French line, government blocked the sale. He tried to buy the Cunard Line, which was the White Star Line's competitor. Parliament said, how dare you? Most of Cunard's ships are military auxiliary vessels that will be useful in time of war. We can't do that. So he couldn't buy Cunard. That was frustrating. He bought Holland America, bought several of those smaller companies, then tried to buy the two big cash cows, the German lines, the Hamburg-American Line and the North German line. Albert Ballin was very alarmed by this, and in a series of meetings with the Kaiser and with J.P. Morgan himself, they ended up engineering a profit-sharing agreement which allowed Hamburg-American Line to remain independent. And the Kaiser made it very clear to Mr. Morgan that no, you cannot have one of Germany's prized corporations. But soon after this deal, J.P. Morgan goes to Hamburg and visits Albert Ballin at his country house and said, Mr. Ballin, you're an absolute genius at shipping. How would you like to work for me, my company, the International Mercantile Marine? I will pay you $1 million a year. It's 1904 money, that's $30, $40 million a year. And by the way, J.P. Morgan, behind closed doors, was very anti-Semitic. He almost never hired Jews. He once told a friend of his in private that my firm and your firm, Baring Brothers of London, are the only two firms operated by white men in this city. Very anti-Semitic. But he took a shine to Albert Ballin. And Albert Ballin said, Mr. Morgan, I appreciate your offer, but I am a patriotic German. I have built this company from the ground up, and no thank you. And he also knew that this company, without his immigrant trade, was not going to work. And International Mercantile Marine is one of J.P. Morgan's very few failures. It is so unsuccessful, it is delisted from the New York Stock Exchange. The only company that makes money is the White Star Line, which has a very robust immigrant business. So this leads to a building war between the White Star Line, backed by J.P. Morgan, and the Hamburg-American Line, where you have, starting in 1909, the building of the three biggest ships in the world, the Olympic, the Titanic, and the Britannic, under the White Star Line. And the Hamburg-American Line responds with three even bigger ships of their own, the very Germanically named Imperator, Vaterland, and Bismarck. These are three German liners. The Imperator, Vaterland, and Bismarck were built to Albert Ballin's highest specifications for luxury, for safety, and they also could carry up to 2,500 people in third class in steerage. The White Star liners, a little bit smaller, but just as luxurious, but they can only carry 1,000 or so people in third class. But this was a building war. The two companies eventually shredded their profit-sharing agreement. And by the way, out of Ballin's three ships, the Imperator, the Vaterland, and the Bismarck, they would sail under different names until the mid-1930s, and their size would not be surpassed until the arrival of the RMS Queen Mary in 1936. So pretty impressive. These ships, each of them clocked in at over 50,000 tons and was well over 900 feet long. And the Titanic, by the way, was the largest ship in the world only for a very brief moment. She would eventually be surpassed by these German liners. Well, the second of these White Star ships is the most famous and infamous ocean liner of all time. The RMS Titanic, when she set sail in April 10th, 1912 from Southampton, England. She was built to carry 3,500 passengers and crew with space for 1,220 lifeboats. She was originally supposed to carry 48 lifeboats, but the chairman of the White Star Line, J. Bruce Ismay, said, well, I mean, this ship is practically unsinkable. They never said unsinkable, they said practically unsinkable. And if the worst should happen and the ship should sink, it'll stay afloat long enough for other ships to arrive and we can just shuttle passengers back and forth with the lifeboats. The Titanic was only carrying 2,200 passengers and crew when she set sail on that maiden voyage. She was less than half full. So she did not sail out in the blaze of publicity. But in first class, among the passengers, she was less than half full in first class, but the total net worth of those first class passengers was over $500 million. Among them was leaders of Gentile societies such as John Jacob Astor, George Widener of Philadelphia and his family, but also many members of the Jewish upper and upper middle class, most notably Isidore and Ida Strauss. Isidore and his brother Nathan were co-owners of Macy's department store. They themselves were German Jewish immigrants from Bavaria. They came over in the 1850s with nothing and have become some of the most successful department store owners in the country. Also Benjamin Guggenheim, whose family had come over from Switzerland. They were among the biggest, they owned the biggest mining fortune in America. Benjamin Guggenheim was traveling with his French mistress. His wife, Florence Seligman Guggenheim, was back at home in New York with the kids. In second class, among many professionals, school teachers, doctors, and clergymen, was a Russian-Jewish couple from Vitebsk, Russia. They were Sinai and Miriam Kantor. They had saved up enough money to travel second class. The thinking was, if you were able to save enough money to go second class, you didn't go through Ellis Island. You'd be processed by immigrant officials on board, because the thinking was, well, if you could save enough, if you had enough money, you probably didn't have diseases or anything like that. You were probably just fine. And in the hold of the Titanic, the Kantors had trunks of Russian furs they planned to sell to finance their medical studies. In third class in the Titanic, there were probably about 50 or 60 or so Jews from Eastern Europe who made the trek over to Cherbourg, France, the ship's second port of call. Also, by the way, as another note, there are actually 80 Syrians who had traveled all the way from Damascus to board the Titanic. I mean, it was a total melting pot on board. But the Titanic did have a small kosher kitchen about the size of a small closet with a kosher chef named Charles Kennel from Southampton, England. And she did have sets of kosher dinnerware up there. On the night of April 14th, 1912, at around 11:40 p.m., she struck an iceberg, sideswiped it, opening about a third of her length to the sea, and for the first hour or so, people didn't want to get off the ship. They were woken up, it was the middle of the night, and first and second class passengers who had lifeboats on their decks, they were like, why should I get into a 32-foot long boat and be lowered down 7 or 8 stories into the ocean? Why? The lights are on, it's warm, no point. One officer approached Isidore Straus and said, Mr. Straus, you're a former congressman. I don't think anyone would mind you getting into a lifeboat. And he said, no, I'll not go before the younger men. And his wife, Ida, famously said, no, Isidore, I'm not leaving you. We've been living together for many years. Where you go, I go. So as we live, so we will die together. Ida Straus was one of 4 first-class women who perished on the Titanic. In second class, Miriam Cantor got into a lifeboat, and Sinai was left behind. By the way, second-class men had the highest casualty rate. Only 14 survived. Third class, there were no lifeboats on their deck areas. They were told by the stewards to stay in place in the public rooms. The only third-class passengers who survived were said, enough of this, and they busted their way through the barriers, keeping them from first and second class up to the upper decks. And it was mostly women, third-class women, who they found their way up that way, they got in the lifeboats. But as one survivor, Colonel Archibald Gracie, the same family as Gracie Mansion, he, like many first-class women, or men, decided it was his duty to stay behind, and he helped women and children in the lifeboats. And just before it was clear the ship was going to sink, he felt he had done his duty. He told his good friend, Clint Smith, we should leave and retreat toward the stern. But then he said, coming up from the first-class grand staircase entrance came this massive tide of people. And he said, oh my God, those are not first or second class passengers, those are steerage passengers. And they had just been let up from the decks below. And he said, my God, the agony of this. Out of the 2,200 passengers and crew, 1,500 lose their lives. Among them, Isidore Straus, George Widener, John Jacob Astor. But the damning statistic is that more first-class men survive than third-class children. A week after the disaster, a cable ship that was chartered by the White Star Line arrives at the site to recover bodies. The crew is quickly overwhelmed. They're only able to take about 300 or so bodies out of the sea before they have to turn around. Among them pulled from the sea is Isidore Straus, but also Sinai Cantor. And this watch is recovered from his body and sent back to his wife, who had survived the disaster. And this is a rare survival of Jewish life on the Titanic. The Strauses were memorialized by the Jewish community in America. They were heroes to Jewish immigrants and also to upper-class German Jews, because they were seen as the ideal of what a Jewish couple should do when faced with death. This Yiddish song is just one of many songs from the Yiddish theater that appeared. And there was a big memorial service at Carnegie Hall given for the Strausses in May of 1912. The 2 eulogists were Jacob Schiff and Andrew Carnegie himself. So this was a big deal. But J.P. Morgan, by the way, was a last-minute cancellation on the Titanic, and he never recovered from this. This is a reputational blow to him. He died a year later. And the Wall Street Journal would later say that the ocean was too big for the old man. What was bad for the White Star Line was very good for the Hamburg-American Line. Passengers, especially immigrants, headed towards his ships. And the SS Imperator of 1913 was the first ocean liner built with enough lifeboats for everyone on board. She even had a huge searchlight on her bow to pick out icebergs. And Albert Ballin was riding high. I mean, the second of these new ships came out in 1914, the Ballin. And his biggest fear, though, was a war breaking out in Europe. Because if a war broke out, especially between Russia and Germany, that would be the end of the immigrant trade. And he used all of his connections, especially in England, to stop the war. He became very good friends with the First Lord of the Admiralty, a young politician named Winston Churchill. Albert Ballin always felt more comfortable in England. He was formed many close connections with members of the aristocracy and with the British Jewish upper class. But despite all of his efforts, the Imperial German government was itching for a fight, especially there's a large chunk of the German aristocracy that wanted to take a nice bite out of Russia's land, out of the province of Poland, and expand itself. And they also stupidly thought that Germany was rich enough and strong enough and technologically advanced enough that they could successfully fight a two-front war, Russia on one side and England and France on the other. Albert Ballin felt that England and Germany should be friends. I mean, the royal family of England were basically German, and they're both competing for empire, competing in the military sphere, but he felt these countries should be natural allies. And he was heartbroken when war did break out in August of 1914. Most of the Hamburg-American Line's 175 ships were stuck in US ports when the war broke out, and then British cruisers basically sailed went up and down the US coast to make sure none of these German ships left. So this basically put immigration to an end. And when war broke out on the Eastern Front, hundreds of thousands of Jews who wanted to get out were trapped and unable to get out. So this basically ruined the Hamburg-American Line and also put Albert Ballin on the outs with Kaiser Wilhelm II. Jacob Schiff found himself in a very tough spot because it took until 1915 with the sinking of the Cunard liner Lusitania, which was the only large liner left in transatlantic service, that turned American opinion against Germany. And Jacob Schiff was very reluctant to condemn Germany, saying, I cannot condemn Germany, that is my mother country. And by the way, I can't support the Allied cause because that's Russia. Russia is the great evil. Actually, it's counterintuitive, but a lot of the Eastern European Jewish community here in Manhattan was tilted more pro-German because they said, America cannot ally itself with Russia. It was seen as unthinkable. Jacob Schiff was eventually forced to concede that America was going to end the war on the Allied side. But he spent a lot of his resources and time helping Russian Jews who were caught in the maw of the Eastern Front, the fighting between Russia, Austria-Hungary, and Germany, setting up the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, which still exists today for that reason. But he also was under suspicion of being a traitor and being a German sympathizer. When America entered the war in 1917, he kind of found himself on the outs politically. It also didn't help that when immigration was cut off by the war, this allowed the ascendancy of a group that had sort of been on the margins of American society for a long time to gain political power. This is a group called the Immigrant Restriction League. It was founded in the 1890s by a group of wealthy Bostonians and New Yorkers. They were deeply connected in high society, but also especially in academia. They were big readers of what we would call today scientific racism, this literature that was being produced in England and in France and Germany at the time, or we'd also call it eugenics today. They would eventually call it eugenics and see it as a good thing. But they basically, this group basically took scientific racism and social Darwinism, brought it to a real fever pitch. And they said, this is science, follow the science and follow the evolution. And in the minds of writers such as Madison Grant, shown here to the left, who was a lawyer who fancied himself in anthropology, said, Europe can be broken up into three groups racially. You have the Nordics, people of Western European descent, British and German descent. They are the highest, they are the explorers, the conquerors. And then you have the Alpines, who are basically Slavs. They're basically destined to be peasants. And then you have the lowest of the low, the Mediterraneans. These are Italians and Jews, and he wrote in his book, The Passing of the Great Race, which came out in 1916, he said, the biggest danger in this country is if the Alpines, especially the Mediterraneans, begin interbreeding with our beautiful Nordic race in America, and that would lead to the downfall of America. The Immigration Restriction League its biggest mouthpiece was a Boston Brahmin senator named Henry Cabot Lodge from Massachusetts. And it wasn't until World War I that this actually went from being kind of a upper class fringe thing to being mainstreamed in academia, the media, cartoons such as this began appearing in respectable publications such as Harper's Magazine. Even people like Theodore Roosevelt, who was president, fancied himself a friend of the immigrants. He condemned the Russian pogroms of the early 1900s, as shown in this picture here, calling the Tsar a preposterous little creature. But by 1916, 1917, Theodore Roosevelt, by the way, had become extremely xenophobic. He sowed distrust of German Americans, and also began buying into this racial science, writing to his friend Madison Grant, saying, "You have written a capital book and everyone should read it." So this becomes, going from being something that was sort of whispered in high society drawing rooms and faculty lounges to being eminently respectable. And in 1917, Congress passes the first legislation that restricts European immigration based on ethnicity. And in 1924, after the war, Congress passes the Johnson-Reed Act that effectively bars all Eastern and Southern European immigration to the United States, laws that remain in place until 1965. Jacob Schiff realizes he's on the losing end of this battle. He was head of the the Liberal Immigration League, but he finds himself, he ends up being sort of the boogeyman to the IRL. Albert Ballin dies in November of 1917, just at the end of the war, and he dies a broken man. Germany erupts in revolution. There's basically a social democratic revolution, and the company is almost destroyed. The day Albert Ballin dies, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicates and flees to Holland with 40 train car loads of art and treasures from Berlin. And from his exile, he takes no responsibility for Germany's defeat. He says, "No, it was not stupid military planning, it was not fighting a two-front war. We could have won this war." You know who was responsible for Germany losing this war? The Jews. And he wrote in private to a friend saying, "The only solution for this betrayal of the Jews would be an international all-world pogrom Russian style. I believe the best solution would be gas." Wow. So this monarch that claimed to have many Jewish friends in Germany, Imperial Germany's height, would be one of the Germans who would predict what would become known as the final solution. Jacob Schiff dies in 1920 and leaves most of his estate to charity. He had given away about half of his fortune during his lifetime to mostly Jewish causes. And at his funeral at Temple Emmanuel, the synagogue is packed. He insists there be no eulogy. And outside the synagogue are thousands of Russian Jews who had trooped up from the Lower East Side on the festival of Sukkot to say goodbye to the man that had made America the golden land for them. The Johnson-Reed Act, by the way, remains in effect until 1965, and it effectively condemns hundreds of thousands of German and Russian and Polish Jews to death in the Holocaust. This story could not have been written without the help of many descendants of the people I've written about. In the 1930s, with the rise of Nazism, Albert Ballin's legacy at the Hamburg-American Line is wiped out. His grandchildren, descended from his adopted daughter Irmgard, make a very brave decision. They take all of his archives, all of his papers, all of his personal effects, and ship them to a family house in Austria and hide them. Thanks to that action, they are not seized by the Nazis, and they are not destroyed by the Allied fire bombing of Hamburg in 1944. In 2021, I was able to visit Albert Ballin's great-grandson, Heinz Weber, and after a 2-hour conversation with him and his wife, and some delicious homemade soccer tour, Heinz and his wife say, "Okay, we have something to give you." And they go to he retreats to his back room and gives me 2 bound volumes saying, "Ingrid and I have transcribed all of Albert Ballin's letters during COVID. We'd like to give you copies." So if not for Heinz Weber, I could not have written this book. And he and his family have done everything they could to preserve the memory of Albert Ballin. And you know, they're Catholics now. They are not they're not blood relations, but Heinz says, I hung this picture of Albert Ballin in my living room. I say good morning to him every day. He said he was a tough businessman, but a wonderful father and a wonderful human being. Also, in postscript, the Warburg family of Hamburg. In 1938, Max and Alice Warburg and their children flee Hamburg for their lives, having lost their bank, their mansion, everything. In 1945, after Max Warburg's death, his son Eric returns to Germany, reclaims their house, fights to get the bank back after it had been Aryanized, and takes up residence in Hamburg, although many of the American Warburgs are like, why are you going back to that horrible country? And Eric says, it is my duty to reclaim what is truly ours. And we will be proud Jews in this country that has been our home for so many centuries. And I was able to visit the Warburg family a number of times and was able to gain access to their archives, which helped me bring the story to life. And this is a picture from their estate overlooking the Elbe River, where the Warburg family are once again the leaders of Germany's Jewish community. And in conclusion, these three men, Albert Ballin, Jacob Schiff, J.P. Morgan, they worked with each other, against each other. They had different motives, profit, philanthropy, everywhere in between. But without their vision and their transportation genius, 2.5 million Jews would not have fled, not have left the old world for the new. And myself and so many others would not be here today. And I'm especially grateful to my wife, Alexandra Vinograd, who, in addition to being a phenomenal doctor, she was a history and German major at Cornell. And she was the one that encouraged me to write this book back in 2019. We've had many visits to the city of Hamburg, which is a city that has become beloved by me and my family. And this is Isaac's first visit to Hamburg. We visited the Ballin Immigration Museum in 2019. And then we visited the Warburg family at their house outside of Hamburg. And then in November of 2024, I was the guest of Hapag-Lloyd, which is the successor corporation of the Hamburg-American Line. You still see those containers, Hapag-Lloyd, that's Albert Ballin's company, to give a talk at the Hapag-Lloyd headquarters to mark the 125th anniversary of Albert Ballin becoming a general director of the Hamburg-American Line. And it was truly moving to be in this building that Albert Ballin had built. His legacy has been restored in the city of Hamburg. The main street in front of the headquarters is named Ballin. There's a big bust in front of in the entrance to the headquarters. And the slogan that he came up with, "My field is the world, mein Feld ist die Welt," is still emblazoned above the company headquarters. I was grateful to be joined by Bettina Lutgerat, who is one of the leaders of Hamburg's Jewish community, the Consul General, Jason Schuh, and also my good friend Friedrich von Bülow, who is descended from the Chancellor of Germany in the early 1900s, who was a deep, deep friend and admirer of Albert Ballin, and thought that Albert Ballin should have been Chancellor of Germany. And maybe Germany could have averted that great catastrophe if he had taken that job. But it's been a wonderful journey. It's an honor to speak here at the Village Preservation Society. Also, just as a postscript, I gave this talk in Hamburg the day after Trump was elected in Hamburg, and it was. I felt like, okay, here I am in the city of Hamburg as the main American event, and it's my job as an American to tell the story at this moment. And it was an honor to do it in this great city. So thank you so much. I'm here to answer some questions. I know it is.
Why did they seal those cars?
Because the German government did not want people to jump out of the cars and end up settling in Germany. The German government said, we don't want it. We're happy to carry the migrants, but we don't want them to get off. So that was, and it is very eerie. It is very spooky that same mode of transfer will be used 30 years later. Yes.
I actually have two questions. How long did it take for these ships to sail from Hamburg to America?
It's a very good question. By around 1910, it would probably take about 7 to 8 days, which is quite an improvement because, you know, with sailing ships, that would be a 6-week voyage at best, sometimes as long as 3 months. But yeah, I think if you were sailing on one of the big Hamburg-American Line ships, you'd depart Hamburg, you'd call it Southampton, then call it Cherbourg, France to pick up more immigrants, and then you'd sail across the Atlantic. But it was about a 7-day journey, although some of the older, slower ships would take about 2 weeks. So, and often the newer the ship, the more expensive the ticket.
My second question, actually, my family was Russian Jewish and came over during that time. So this is pretty, thank you, it's fascinating talk. But my second question was, were people in first class aware of the thousands in steerage class?
Oh, they were aware, I think, but I think these ships were so big and there were so many barriers, preventing them from going there, that they were kind of out of sight, out of mind. And these ships were very carefully designed to ensure segregation of the classes. I mean, there's weird. I mean, it's a foreign concept today of having this class segregation. You don't see that on cruise ships today at that level. But I think that when you go out in the open decks, however, and you're promenading around, you would, if you were first or second class, you would look down below to the lower decks, like a well deck, and you would see the third class passengers. There were signs saying, don't throw food at the third class passengers. So.
All right, final question.
Thank you for that wonderful presentation. My great Zaidi used to meet immigrants that were landsmen at Ellis Island and invite them over, to invite them for a Shabbos meal or something like that. My question is, were stops made at Rotterdam, at any of the English ports? Was there emigration leaving Europe from those other Western European ports as well? And were some of those ships arriving in Canada or some of the other major ports in North America?
That's a very good question. And yeah, thanks for using the term landsman. You had these landsman associations where basically if someone from your village came over, you would welcome them, and you'd have these little associations. I think they were fraternal organizations. But yes, I mean, you had steamship lines like the Holland-American Line would leave Rotterdam. You had some immigrants leave there. You would have the Canadian Pacific Line leave from Liverpool, and they would sail to Quebec and Montreal. And yeah, I mean, one reason why there's not a large, but notable Jewish population in England was that a lot of immigrants would do an indirect voyage. They would sail from Hamburg or Bremen and stop in Liverpool and be like, actually, maybe I'll just hang out here and stay here versus go to America. So yeah, there were several. I mean, also the Canard Line operated ships out of Trieste, Italy, and a lot of Austro-Hungarian Jews would sail out of the Mediterranean because that was closer.
All right, another round of applause.